So this is kind of where we left off yesterday. For those of you that were in class or have watched the video on the levels of government, we kind of left off here. We talked briefly about the different branches of the government, and I'll kind of go over that again quickly, and then kind of get more in depth when it comes to talking about the different branches of the government, who they are, and kind of what they do. So the U.S. government is broken up into three separate branches of the government with three distinct roles. So the first is, and I'll just kind of go from left to right here, the legislative branch. So the legislative branch is the branch of the government that makes laws, creates laws, comes up with ideas for laws, and then ultimately votes on approval for those laws. That would be Congress, and Congress, our Congress, is what we call a bicameral Congress. In other words, there are two houses of Congress, right? So you can see up here in the diagram that the Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay, so we're going to talk about them more in detail in just a second. The executive branch would be the president and all of the president's staff. So anyone that the president appoints to work in his or her cabinet. And their job is to essentially enforce or enact laws. So Congress comes up with laws and passes them, and then ultimately the president and his office or her office, they are the ones that approve the law or sign it into being. And without that presidential approval, a law cannot be passed. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There are some ways and things that happen when that is the case, but we'll get there later. And then lastly, the judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and the federal court circuit, so the national courts. So judicial branch is more than just the Supreme Court, it's all national federal, right? So, and their job is to interpret laws. In other words, decide if they are constitutional or legal, right? So without further ado, that's kind of where we left off. Let me get into talking more specifically about those branches. So we'll start with the executive branch. The executive branch is the president and their cabinet. Again, they enforce and enact laws, put laws into being. Presidents can serve 2 separate 4-year terms. So every 4 years we have a presidential election. President can run for re-election 1 time, and after that, somebody else's turn to become president. So that is a relatively new amendment to the Constitution that we talked about a couple days ago. In, I believe, 1950 something or other, 51. They limited the amount of terms a president could serve. Before that, a president could serve 4-year terms indefinitely. Right? It was decided that it was best for our country and our democracy that we only allow a president, no matter how good or bad or popular or unpopular, to serve a maximum of 8. Okay? Some of their powers or the things that the president can do. The president can appoint justices. So court, we're talking about judges, court justices. And again, that is for the Supreme Court. So if there's an opening on the Supreme Court or any federal court post, those judges are all appointed by the president. They also appoint ambassadors and make treaties. All of those things, however, need the Senate's approval. So when we get into talking about checks and balances, which hopefully we get into today, that will come up again. So the Senate ultimately has to approve those appointments, but the president gets to decide who fills those. They can issue pardons. So when we're talking about pardons, that is somebody who's committed a crime or been accused of a crime, the president can basically say, you have been pardoned, and they're let out of jail and or prison, and their crimes are forgiven. They also serve as the commander-in-chief, so the president can send out troops. They're ultimately the leader of the U.S. military. So whereas on one side they're the leader of the country. They're also technically the leader of the military. But only Congress can actually declare war. So the president can send out troops, but only with congressional approval can we actually declare war. The president can also issue executive orders, and these are laws that are not made by Congress. They have a little different scope and authority to them, but ultimately presidents have the power to issue executive orders without congressional oversight. And this part here about vetoes, this is something that we were kind of hinting at earlier. So when a law is made by Congress, the president, like I said, can choose to veto or deny that law. And basically when that happens, the president returns the bill to Congress and says, nope, try again, I don't like it. And Congress either changes the bill and sends it back to the president for approval, or if Congress decides they really think this should be a law, then they have to have a 2/3 majority vote to put the law into action. That's possible, right? So that veto can be overridden if Congress, if both houses of Congress vote, 2/3 of those bodies vote to override the veto, then it will become a law regardless of presidential approval or not. Whereas typically a law only takes 1 point over 50%, right? Just it takes the majority. Okay. The president also issues State Union addresses. The line of succession, in other words, if the president were to die or be impeached and removed from office, the line of succession would be Vice President, Speaker of the House, President pro temp, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense. So it's unlikely that you get that far down the list, but there it is just in case you want to know. And then at the very bottom there, the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the voting body that ultimately votes for presidential election, on presidential election. All right, so that's enough with the executive branch. I'm just going to kind of keep moving through this stuff, and I apologize if it's just kind of a lot of information. I'm just throwing it out there, and you can kind of go through it on your own and hopefully get something out of it. So next up is the judicial branch. So the judicial branch is, again, the Supreme Court and the entire federal court system, and they interpret the laws. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, and these justices are appointed by the president, and again, they have to be approved by the Senate with a majority vote. And justices on the Supreme Court serve a lifetime, so they can choose to retire, but ultimately they can serve as long as they want, right, or are able to. Okay? So there are 9 justices. One of them is considered to be Chief Justice, or kind of the head of the Supreme Court. And again, they interpret the Constitution and determine whether laws are constitutional or not. In other words, do they follow the guidelines set by the Constitution, or do they violate them? Right? So here is kind of a full look at the federal court system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this, but just keep it in mind that the judicial branch of the government is more than just the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is just the highest court when it comes to the federal court system, but there are also lots of different courts at a lower level spread out all over the country. So you can kind of see up here, this first chart, there is a court of military appeals, there's a U.S. Court of Appeals, and then there's a U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. You can, I'm not going to kind of go through all these little subcategories, but you can kind of look at them yourself. The important thing to know is that basically the federal court system has overreach over the entire country. Right? So that is all that that's all the time I really want to spend on that. So if you're just joining us, we're just kind of going through the different branches of the government. We went through the executive branch and talked about the president and the president's role and the judicial branch and the courts. So lastly, I want to talk about the legislative branch, and this is kind of the one that we'll spend the most time on because it's kind of the most complicated. There's the most going on. But Congress, again, is made up of two different bodies or two different chambers. And when we first set up our country, we initially had only one body of Congress. And the original 13 states had, only one representative. So each state had a representative, and that was it. But ultimately, when we redid our Constitution, for those of you that remember talking about the Articles of Confederation and how that led to the Constitution, when we redid our Constitution, we ultimately came up with a different plan, and it was ultimately this compromise between two different ideas. One idea was that every state, no matter how big or small, should have equal representation, and the other side of that argument was that states with more people or greater population should have more representation. So there was this battle going on over how to set up Congress. Should it be everyone gets the same, or should it be proportional to population? And so when we did or redid the Constitution, this compromise came about where we created two separate bodies, one which was based on population, and one which was given equal representation to all the states. So the House of Representatives is what we call the lower house. In other words, stuff starts in the House of Representatives, but then has to go up to the Senate. So the Senate essentially has authority over the House of Representatives when it comes to lawmaking, right? So the House of Representatives is based on population, and it's much larger, whereas the Senate is the upper or the more powerful of the two bodies when it comes to lawmaking, and the Senate is based entirely on states, right? So Alaska gets 2 senators, California gets 2 senators, Washington gets 2 senators, and everyone in between gets 2, right? So everyone has equal representation, okay? All right, so first, the House of Representatives. So again, I apologize for just kind of going through this. If you want to slow down or ask any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. And then if there are questions at the end, I will open it up for discussion if anyone has questions. All right, so the House of Representatives, again, is the lower chamber, and it's based on population. We kind of already said that. There are 435 representatives. To be a representative, you must be at least 25 years old, must have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years, and you have to live in that state. Representatives only serve 2-year terms. They're short. The House of Representatives are all constantly running for re-election. They can be re-elected indefinitely, right? So there isn't a limit on how many terms they can serve. They just have to be re-elected every 2 years. Only the House can introduce spending bills, and all that means is the Senate can't say, oh, I want to introduce this bill to spend all this money on such and such. Skip the House of Representatives. House of Representatives is the one that has to start the bill and then approve it and pass it to the Senate, and the Senate has to then approve it and pass it on to the President. Okay? And the House of Representatives also have the power to censure and impeach, or open up an impeachment investigation, which we've recently had, right? The House of Representatives decided to open an impeachment hearing, went up to the Senate, and the Senate had their hearing, and so on and so forth, right? And the impeachment is essentially the removal of somebody from their position, whether that be the president or it can be a Supreme Court justice, right? So an impeachment can apply to different or multiple posts, not just the president. Okay, so there's kind of a little map, and I'm not sure how old this is, so I'm not going to 100% stand by its perfect validity. I probably should update it. But just to give you an idea, you see some of the states that have just one representative: North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, Wyoming, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, all just have one representative, right? Whereas on the other side, California has 53, Texas has 36, so on and so forth. Washington has 10. I'm not sure if they are up to 11 or 12 now, but anyway, we're kind of right in that middle ground, right? So you get the general idea of how the House of Representatives is. So, whoops, sorry. And let me make sure I'm getting happy with my mouse clicking here. There we go. All right, so let's make sure I'm doing all right on time. Okay, so the Senate again is the upper chamber, or kind of the more powerful chamber when it comes to lawmaking. And again, there are 100 senators, 2 for each state. So the requirements for Senate, or being a senator, are a little bit greater than that of the House of Representatives. You have to be at least 30 years old, so not 25. You have to be a citizen for 9 years. You have to live in that state. So becoming a senator typically requires more experience. Not always, but that's why it's set up that way. Senators also serve 6-year terms instead of the 2-year terms. And it says here, those elections are staggered every 2 years. So what that means is there is never a situation where one state has both Senate seats open, right? So in other words, they stagger them every 2 years. And so you're not voting for both Washington Senate seats on the same election. Okay? And the Senate must approve treaties. They ultimately declare war and approve appointees. Okay, so that's kind of their roles. Let's see, moving on through that. All right, and this I think is where I will kind of stop for the day after we discuss checks and balances and what they are, and then we'll hopefully have enough time to do a couple questions. So checks and balances are basically the term given to the idea that each branch has a certain power or authority over the other, right? So that one branch doesn't have more power than the other two. Ultimately, we think of the president as being supreme in power, but in reality, in the way our government is set up, it's not set up that way. It's set up so that not one of these 3 branches can have more power than the other, right? And so I'll just kind of go through this diagram here kind of briefly, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So again, the president and the executive branch have authority over the other 2 branches because they have the ability to veto or deny laws that are made by Congress. So Congress gets to make laws. But the president has the power to say, no, I don't like that law. Try again, right? The president has the power over the Supreme Court because when open seats, the Supreme Court or the federal court system, anytime an opening comes up on one of those courts, the president ultimately gets to decide which person serves on the court. So that's a certain authority or a certain power the president has over the judicial branch. Congress, on the other hand, they have power because even though presidents are allowed to veto laws or deny them, Congress has the power to even override those vetoes. Now, it's pretty tough to do, and it doesn't happen very often, but the power is at least there and present, right? Congress can choose to do that and ultimately pass a law that the president denies. So that's a certain power that Congress has over the president. And then Congress also has some authority over the judicial branch because they are the ones that actually have to approve and vote for the justices and the judges that get put onto the courts by the president. So the president gets to appoint them, but then the Senate ultimately gets to say yes or no. So they get kind of the last say. And then the last one down here, the Supreme Court can declare laws made by Congress and any executive orders that the president puts out. So again, those executive orders are the laws that the president can just sign into law without congressional approval. Both of those types of laws, so laws made the traditional way through Congress, laws made by executive order, both of those are subject to Supreme Court approval, right? And so this has happened lots of times where, especially executive orders, where presidents want to put something into law really quickly. They don't want congressional approval. They just want to make an executive order and put it out there. A lot of times those come back and the Supreme Court says, nope, that is infringing on constitutional rights. Either try again or they throw it out entirely, right? So the idea and the hope and the way that the reason this was created was to try to limit the power of government, or to keep from having an authoritarian leadership where we have one person or one small body that has all the power, right? The idea is to kind of spread the power out. So there's kind of the, this diagram is essentially just kind of going through exactly what we said. And if you want to come back and look at this, you can always check the video out after class or whenever we get it posted up. And so next week we will start here on talking about the electoral system, our political party systems, and so on and so forth. But that's kind of a topic for next week. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share there. And let's see, I will at least put up a couple questions and we can kind of go through them. But let's so this is the same page we did yesterday, but we skipped a couple of these. So I think we're just going to do 3 and 4. So if anybody's following along, and I see that we've got a couple, let's do number 3. And if you want to go ahead and just you want to go ahead and do number 3 and enter your answer into the chat, we'll discuss it here in a minute or so. So while we're finishing up, I'll go ahead and kind of summarize and read the question here. But we're just doing number 3, and then I think we'll eventually get to number 4, and we'll just end there. But number 3 says, why do lifetime appointments help ensure that federal judges rule impartially on legal issues? Okay. So again, to answer this question, you need to have at least a little bit of vocabulary, right? You have to know what impartial means. So let's go ahead and look at our options. A, federal judges need not worry about pleasing their constituents in order to be reelected. B, only people who demonstrate loyalty to the ruling party or the ruling political party are appointed. C, lifetime appointments mean that federal judges acquire a great deal of experience. And D, a federal judge must be impartial or he or she will not be reelected. Okay. So, again, the question is straightforward. The answer options make it less so. Okay, so really make sure you look through these carefully and make sure that you're going with an answer that really seems to get to the heart of the question or answer the question directly, right? Because there are, again, some true statements hidden in there that aren't necessarily direct answers to the question. Okay, so think about this for a minute before we even talk about the answer choices. So in theory, right, the Supreme Court has lifetime sentences. In other words, they get to serve for life. And that is very intentional. Right? And it was set up that way for a specific reason. And so we're trying to get at why we think that was the case. So I would start by maybe finding 1 or 2 options that seem particularly off or wrong. B stands out to me as being maybe the first one that I would get rid of. Only people who demonstrate loyalty to the ruling party, political party, are appointed. Now, unfortunately, that may be the case, especially these days, but that doesn't answer the question, right? Why do lifetime appointments ensure federal judges rule impartially? That would be evidence to the contrary, right? If the question had said something about being biased or favoring a certain political party, then B might be the correct answer. But we're trying to get to an answer that explains why judges are supposed to be ruling impartially or unbiased, right? In other words, being totally neutral, right? And then the other one that I would probably throw out would be D. A federal judge must be impartial or he or she will not be reelected. Now, the problem with D is that it sounds great, but think about that. Are federal judges elected? No, right? Federal judges are not elected. Federal judges are appointed, and so they don't run for reelection. Right? So D directly doesn't answer the question. And so then, ultimately, between A and C, those are kind of our best choices or our best options. A says federal judges need not worry about pleasing their constituents in order to be reelected. Or C, lifetime appointments mean that federal judges acquire a great deal of experience. Both sound like pretty viable answers. But ultimately here, if you chose A, you would be correct, right? So it's true, right? Of course, by serving a lifetime, you gain lots of experience, right? But the idea that someone is ruling impartially or absent of any influence, right, would be A. Because in theory, if they're serving a lifetime sentence, they don't have to worry about pleasing whoever's in power at the time because they're going to outlast whoever that person is, right? So the correct answer for this would be A. All right, so lastly, number 4, I'm just going to kind of run through this. And for those of you checking this out on the YouTube channel, you can kind of try to mix and match these. I won't spend a lot of time on it, and then I'm going to kind of wrap things up. But ultimately, this is just like a fill in the blank, right, or a match. So we've got our terms up here: checks and balances, veto, senators, constituents, and representatives. And down here, we've got some different options, right? So again, you can kind of go through this on your own time, but I'll just kind of go through and match these up real quickly. So checks and balances, remember, right here, limits that one branch of government can place on the other branches. So the idea that each branch has certain powers over the other branches. Veto, remember, veto is when we were talking about laws being made. Veto is the president's power to strike down a law. The president's power to strike down a law would be veto. Senators are legislators who serve 6-year terms. Legislator is another word for member of Congress, lawmaker, right? Those are all different terms you may or may not see. So senators serve 6-year terms, and we'll skip constituents and come down to representatives. And remember, representatives are legislators or Congress people who serve 2-year terms, right? So that leaves us with constituents, which is a word we heard up here in number 3. And constituents are just a term for the people who political leaders represent, right? So we are constituents of the people that we've voted for, right? So the governor of Washington, whoever is our state senator, get the idea. So we're that person's constituent. We ultimately choose to elect or not elect. All right, so we'll go ahead and stop there for the day. If you do have any questions, again, go ahead and contact us through the website and keep tuning in for classes. I will be back next week with some more social studies and a little more civics and government before we move on to something else. All right, well, that's it for me. I will see you next week. Have a nice weekend, and I will talk to you all later.